Now that we've deep dived into Visions of Mana and all finished with it, I figure now's as good a time as any to rank the entire Mana series, as I've played pretty much every game there is in the series. So from the classic adventures dating all the way back to Final Fantasy Adventure, let's see where our favourites land, and more importantly where the most recent entry ranks amongst the other games in the series. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. So we're going to start off with the games that I have not played in the Mana series, as unlike Final Fantasy, I haven't played every single game in the Mana series. However, in my defense, that's because for the most part you actually can't anymore, and those games are going to be Friends of Mana, Circle of Mana, and Rise of Mana. All three of these were live service titles that have been released only in Japan, and some of them function on the GREE social platform, which is something we don't have in the West, and therefore I've just never gotten to play any of these before their servers shut down. There is one other Mana game that I have not played, which is Adventures of Mana, which is a second remake of Final Fantasy Adventure, unlike Sword of Mana, which I have played. So I figured I'd get those out of the way before we got into the actual list. So where better to start than from the very beginning? We're talking about Final Fantasy Adventure. I actually really enjoy Final Fantasy Adventure. I actually think it still stands the test of time really well, especially considering that it was originally released for the very first Game Boy. And for that reason, I'm actually going to put it in A tier. It's got decent challenge to it. The gameplay was very fresh and original at the time, marrying the iconography of Final Fantasy like Moogles and Chocobos, etc., with a top-down action RPG like the original Zelda. And in the Venn diagram of games that I enjoy, I am a huge fan of the original Zelda games, like the top-down Zeldas. Link to the Past is one of my favourite games, if not my favourite game ever made, but still having that Final Fantasy feel, it still sits really well. And if you have access to this, either through the collection of Mana or just having a copy or emulation or anything like that, I would encourage you to give Final Fantasy Adventure a go. It's not super long, it's decently challenging, it's just fun, and that's something I really love about the Mana franchise as a whole. They're just good games. Now, Secret of Mana, which is Seiken Densetsu 2, we'd be stupid not to put it in S tier, wouldn't we? It's just not right to not put it at the pinnacle of its era. Like, Secret of Mana put this franchise on the map, and it's kept it on the map. People love this game with good reason. The presentation for its time was absolutely mind-blowing, along the lines of Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI. And if a game can be held in as high regard as those two, you know you're doing pretty well. The characters stand out, the music stands out, the way that you play the game is really original. It's definitely an action RPG, much like Final Fantasy Adventure before it, but you have to be more methodical in how you play it. You can't just run in and just keep smashing the A button. You have to know what you're doing as you enter a fight. And it's just really aged very well. Again, collection of Mana, it's present on there. It's on there's all sorts of ways to play Secret of Mana. If you haven't played it already and you're just coming into the Mana series because of Visions of Mana or Trials of Mana, you owe it to yourself to play Secret of Mana as well. Now, I actually think Seiken Densetsu 3, which is Trials of Mana in its original form, is better than Secret of Mana, which is possibly a hot take. But I'm actually only going to put it in A tier, and the reason for that is because it was never available to us outside of Japan, or anyone outside of Japan, for such a long period of time that getting access to it was always a bit of a pain in the backside. Obviously, recently it's been added in Collection of Mana, and it still retains a lot of what makes it so strong. But we also have a remake that kind of trumps it, in my opinion, in practically every way. But if you want the 2D art style, the old school presentation, then you can't go wrong with Seiken Densetsu 3 either. It's just, again, it encapsulates RPG and action Zelda-like gameplay perfectly. You have replayability in there because you have 6 main characters and you can only choose 3 of them at the start of the game. And for a game of that age, that was just unprecedented at the time. So it's just brilliant, and I've got nothing bad to say about it. I just think the remake is a bit better, and that's why it's an A tier and not an S tier. So now we have Legend of Mana. Now, maybe this is a hot take, so I know some people really like this game, but this is the first Mana game that I've played that I didn't really gel with very much, so I'm going to put it in C tier. I know some people really like it, but I always found Legend of Mana to be a bit of a misnomer within the franchise. It doesn't gel in the same way that the games that came before it did. It just it's very piecemeal. The way you play Legend of Mana is that you place icons on a map that are the environments in which you go into, and you have to perform quests that kind of just feel really disjointed, and you have to make sure everything's placed in the right order, and it just got really confusing in the way that I played it. I do own this on PS4, so I may go back to it, but I don't feel the impetus to play Legend of Mana because of the weirdness of its mechanics like I do Seiken Densetsu 1, 2, and 3. Legend of Mana is more of a spin-off. It's not Seiken 4. That reserved for a different game, which we'll get to in a minute. But I just couldn't get on with this particular game. But let me know in the comments below if it's something that you really enjoyed. So fun fact, even though I've played the first 3 Mana games, they are not the first Mana game that I played. The first Mana game that I played was actually Sword of Mana for the Game Boy Advance. And I liked it. Like, it got me interested enough in the Mana franchise for me to finish the game and want to explore more of the franchise. And I was only a teenager when I played Sword of Mana. Sword of Mana is a remake of Final Fantasy Adventure, but it's actually really quite different from FF Adventure. It doesn't feel the same. You have 2 characters, a hero and a heroine, and you control one of them at a time, and the AI controls the other one. But being a really early GBA game, the AI is absolutely abysmal. And it looks nice for a GBA game. It plays fairly well. It's not the first game I'd recommend to people when it comes to Mana. Like, you can't really beat the first 3 games from this period of time. But it's a good enough game that I would suggest perhaps exploring it if you've already done some of the bigger ones. So then we get to the first of the DS Mana games, which would be Children of Mana. Now, the opposite problem to Legend of Mana, I don't hear a lot of people that like this game very much, but I actually do, so I'm going to put it in B tier along with Sword of Mana. Children of Mana plays very differently to the other Mana games in that it's more of a dungeon crawler than it is a full-fledged RPG. It has multiplayer capabilities, not that I had any friends to play Children of Mana with when I was in school, but I still really like this game. It's simplistic, it's fun, like the weapon system is good, you develop... It is a little on the repetitive side, but one of the things I really like about the Mana franchise, and I use this term in my review for Visions of Mana, is that it feels like soul food for the JRPG fan. Like, it just feels comfortable to play a Mana game. And I think that Children of Mana is a game that I can play and I can switch off and I can just mess around in some dungeon crawling fun. And that's good enough for me. I absolutely cannot say the same for Dawn of Mana. Dawn of Mana, I think, is probably the only game on this list that's going to be going straight into D tier. And I hate that Dawn of Mana is considered Seiken Densetsu 4 because it's terrible. It's boring. There's barely any story involved in it. The gameplay isn't fun, there's no progression in it because your abilities reset every time you enter a new area. It's ugly, the music's not even as good as a lot of the other games. I apologise to anyone that likes Dawn of Mana or grew up with it, because I didn't play Dawn of Mana until much later in life. I wish I hadn't. Like, I really just don't think that game is good at all. Then we have Heroes of Mana, which is the other DS game. And this era of Mana, which was very long-winded, is frustrating because it was evident that Koichi Ishii wanted to take the franchise in a completely different direction from that which made it popular to begin with, and it didn't really work. So Heroes of Mana is actually an RTS game. It's weird and very slow, and I think that a lot of people actually prefer this to Children of Mana, which is the other DS game. But I prefer Children because I think that at least that's simpler and more akin to what the rest of the franchise is. It's still not the same as the first 3 Mana games, but it's closer. And Heroes of Mana, I just felt like I was getting bored. Again, I played it a very, very many years ago, so I haven't played it in a very long time. But at the time, I just wasn't engaged with the game. And by this point in time, I was getting really frustrated that Mana just wasn't being Mana anymore. And maybe that's given me some bias as to why I don't like Heroes of Mana, so I put it in C tier, even though I don't think it's nearly as bad as Dawn of Mana is. But I'd be curious to hear from others who played Heroes and Children of Mana, which of the 2 games you preferred. Then we have Secret of Mana's remake. So Secret of Mana's remake is derided pretty heavily for not being nearly as good as Secret of Mana is, and I would agree with that. The modern remake of it doesn't remake it enough to make it feel like it warranted having one. And it is a bit strange. As we'll get to with like Trials of Mana's remake, which feels a lot more fleshed out, Secret of Mana's remake felt really pared back, which is very strange considering the pedigree of the game it came from. And I don't really understand why it was that way. Like, it doesn't look very nice, it's buggy, it doesn't really retain the spirit of Secret of Mana, even though it's technically the same game. I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be, but admittedly, I've never finished the remake, so maybe it gets worse as you play it. But from what I've played of it, it's okay. I just don't think there's much reason to play it if the original exists, because the original's kind of just better. Now, Trials of Mana's remake, that's a different story. Trials of Mana's remake goes to S tier for me. This game got me through lockdown. Like, it came out in 2020, and I loved it. I loved every second of it. I have gone through this game and 100%ed it on the Switch and the PS4 and got the Platinum for it, and it was what made me go back and experience the Mana games I hadn't played up until that point, which unfortunately included Dawn of Mana. This is the epitome, alongside Secret of Mana, that these games are just comfort food for JRPG fans. They're not especially difficult games, to be honest. Like, none of them are, really. Unless, you know, trying to get through Dawn of Mana you consider difficult. But it's just fun. You know, the characters are silly and likable. There's a lot of brightness and whimsy to the Mana games that I just adore, and Trials' remake absolutely serves in droves. There's reason to replay it, much like the original version. There's a lot of things that I've already covered by talking about Seiken Densetsu 3 with Trials of Mana remake, but the remake just adds enough where the Secret of Mana remake didn't, that puts it above the original version for me. And there's like extra post-game content that's present in Trials' remake that wasn't present in the original. There's reasons to just keep playing it, and that's why I've played it multiple times. It's just because it felt like a good book that I already knew well, and I didn't have to put much effort into wanting to play it again. And I think that there's a lot to be said for games like that. So the last game before Visions of Mana is Echoes of Mana. Now, Echoes of Mana was a gacha game that lasted less than a year, which is kind of tragic. I did play it when it released, because by this point I was very invested in the Mana franchise, but it just didn't do anything new or interesting. It was as generic a gacha as gachas get, and for me to want to play a gacha, it has to really blow me out of the water. I can enjoy a gacha game still, but I can never really love one beyond the IP it comes from. And Echoes of Mana was like, it was nice to see a lot of the characters coming back again. You know, like I wanted my Kevin from Trials of Mana remake, and my Hawkeye, and my Randy from Secret of Mana. But I just didn't think the game was particularly fun. And the fact that it lasted less than a year goes to show that apparently not a lot of other people really enjoyed it either. So unfortunately, I'm going to put it in D tier alongside Dawn of Mana. So the big question, where does Visions of Mana sit? Well, I can speak personally from here, but I would honestly put it alongside Trials of Mana remake and Secret of Mana at the top of the list. I adored Visions of Mana. I was really nervous about it when I first played the demo. I thought, oh, this feels like Trials of Mana, but a little bit worse in most ways. It felt sluggish, it felt weird, it felt a bit empty with the giant open areas and everything. But when the full game came around and I started playing it, it made sense in its context, and I got to play more of it, and it really expanded itself. And I loved it. I loved every second of it. I think the story is more grandiose than any of the other Mana games. I think that the level of customization that's present in Visions of Mana far exceeds that of any other Mana game. You know, Trials of Mana is good with its like class system. Visions of Mana blows it out of the water. There are small things I prefer about Trials to Visions, but they are very minor. Other than that, I'd say that Visions of Mana absolutely deserves to be put at the top of the list alongside Secret of Mana and Trials of Mana's remake, as these being the three I would recommend to people who want to explore the Mana series. As a matter of fact, if you really wanted to explore it, all you need to do is buy Collection of Mana, because you'd get Final Fantasy Adventure, Secret of Mana, and Seiken Densetsu 3. Then if you like Seiken Densetsu 3, I'd encourage you to try the Trials of Mana remake, and if you feel like you've gotten enough out of that already and you don't need to play the remake, just jump straight to Visions of Mana, because those games, one after the other, again, you'll feel that comfortable, fun, enjoyable vibe from each and every one of those games. Anything under that, I'd say you could probably miss out on. I think that it's okay to not play those. The B tier games, I'd say you could explore if you wanted more, but the C and D tier games, I think you can easily just miss out on. But these 5 games at the top here in the S and A ranks, I think everyone should explore, particularly JRPG fans. So that's my tier list for the Mana series. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'd love for you guys to compare your own tier lists with mine and see where each of the Mana games sits for you. I think Visions has now become my favourite game in the series. It's neck and neck with the Trials remake. Secret of Mana falls a little bit underneath, but its pedigree pushes it still to that same tier as the other two. But I'd be curious to see what you see. So let me know in the comments below what your favourite game in the Mana series is. And if you're not sure what to comment, just type the word algorithm, because it's actually really helpful if you do. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here today, perhaps consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join up on my Patreon where you can get all sorts of additional benefits, or you can have a look at my Etsy store for my art prints, and I'll be making some for the Mana series as well, so that's going to be really fun. So keep your eyes peeled on that, and perhaps considering clicking the link in the description box below and favoriting my Etsy store for art prints in the future. Thank you all very much for joining, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.